I found a dying alien soldier in my cargo hold, and she begged me not to call her people. The salvage field above the wreck of the dry Hesht convoy on the cold side of outer cinder smelled, even through Sam Holloway's filter mask, of scorched alloy and old propellant and something organic and unsettled that the Void had not yet finished picking apart. He had been working the field alone for 9 hours by his suit chronometer. He had a manifest list of recoverable salvage clipped to his thigh. He had 2 cargo crates of slip drive coils already netted to the hull of the Calder. He had 400 meters of remaining tow line and a careful 3-day window before the Pan compact patrols rotated back into the system and began asking questions about who had pulled what out of a battlefield that did not have a clean export charter. He intended to fill his hold and be gone in 18 hours. He was 38 years old. He was mixed heritage, half Korean-American on his mother's side and half Lakota on his father's. Born on a frontier mining colony around the gas giant Bredza 3, and raised by an older sister after both parents died in the same depressurization accident when he was 6. He had a quiet, tired face that had been working for a living since he was 12. With high cheekbones, a strong jaw, dark almond-shaped eyes that had gone tired around the edges in the way the eyes of working men go tired when nobody has been paying close attention to them. And short black hair he kept cut down to nothing because he wore a vacuum helmet for half his working hours. He had a thin, clean-edged scar across the bridge of his nose from a salvage accident in his 2nd year. He was lean, broad-shouldered, 5 feet 11 inches tall, the build of a man who had been moving heavy crates by hand for 2 decades. He wore a battered gray and orange salvage suit with the Brenari Salvage Guild patch on the right shoulder, a worn brown Henley visible at the throat under the suit's open seal, dark utility trousers, and reinforced black work boots magnetized for hull walking. On the inside of his suit collar, where nobody else could see it, was a small folded photograph of his younger brother Caleb, taken on the day Caleb had shipped out to the Severin 4 reclamation conflict 8 years ago. Caleb had not come home. Sam Holloway had been working salvage on rim battlefields ever since, partly because the work paid well, and partly because somewhere in the back of his head, he had not yet stopped looking for his brother's remains. The wreck was a dry Hesht escort frigate, a long, thin vessel that had been bisected at the engine block by a Yannick coil-cannon strike 11 days before. The forward half, where Sam was working, had drifted into a slow tumble against a shelf of asteroidal rock half a click away from the main convoy debris field. The forward half held the cargo deck and the small infirmary compartment and the slip drive bay he had already stripped. He had pulled 6 functional coils, an entire forward sensor mast, and a Brenari-made nav rotor he was particularly proud of recovering intact, because the Brenari nav rotor alone was going to pay his fuel bill for a quarter. He came back into the forward half through the auxiliary airlock at the end of his 9th hour to do one final sweep of the cargo deck for anything portable he had missed on the first 3 passes. The cargo deck was 40 meters end to end, lined on either side with crumpled racking and the spilled contents of crates that had let go in the strike. He had been through it twice. He did not expect to find anything else. He certainly did not expect to find the soldier. She had crawled in. He understood that, before he understood much else. She had crawled in through the auxiliary airlock the way he had just walked in, except that she had crawled in 11 days ago, before the Yannick strike had broken the convoy in half. And she had been hiding in the cargo deck for those 11 days because her own people had been hunting her. Sam came around the 3rd row of racking with the white halo of his suit lamp, making a slow arc across the deck. And the lamp caught a flash of pale matte battle leather, and the lamp held there. And Sam stopped breathing for one long second. She was tall, even folded as she was into the corner behind the third row of racking. Tall and lean and visibly armored, in the dark matte leathers of a Tar-Nethi war officer. The chest plate marked with a small braided spear sigil of a Tar-Nethi warden of the third rank. Her skin was the deep storm gray of a planet's high atmosphere before a thunderstorm, with darker tribal striping running in clean, precise lines along her exposed forearms and along the visible side of her jaw. Her hair was long, white as bone meal, half-shaved on the left side of her skull in the warrior crop her people wore for an active campaign, the unshaved length on the right side, falling forward over her shoulder and matted now at the ends with 11 days of dried blood. Her eyes were closed when his lamp first found her. Her face was set in the steady, patient expression of a person who had decided she was going to die, alone, in this corner, on her own schedule. She had been wounded. He saw the wound when his lamp tracked down. She had a coil-cannon blade fragment lodged through the side of her abdomen below the ribs, a thumb's breadth wide and protruding handsomely from the back of her armor. The wound had been wadded with what looked like the torn lining of her own cloak. The wadding was old. The wadding was crusted black around the edges. Whoever had packed it had done a good job once, probably while still moving. But 11 days of hiding in a depressurized cargo deck had not done it any further favors. Her chest plate rose and fell in shallow, careful breaths under the wadding. She was alive. She was barely alive. Her eyes opened, slow, when she registered the light through her eyelids. They were the steel blue of a hard frost morning, ringed with the smudged remnants of campaign coal. She found his face inside the helmet of his salvage suit. She did not move. Her right hand twitched once toward the hilt of a single curved knife at her hip, then stilled, because reaching for a knife required a force her body did not currently have to give. She said, in careful common galactic, the cadence stiff and formal and unmistakably learned in a Tar-Nethi war academy, "You are a salvager." He nodded inside his helmet. Words inside a sealed suit were a small hassle, and he wanted his hands free. She said, "You are not Pain." He shook his head. She said, "You are not Yannick." He shook his head again. She closed her eyes for a long second. She opened them. She said, the words coming slow and very deliberate so he would not miss them, "Do not call my people." He stared at her. She said again, in the same slow, deliberate voice, "Do not call them." She said, "If you call them, I am dead before they board." She said, "Please." The word "please" from a Tar-Nethi warden, who Sam Holloway happened to know from 20 years of cantina rumor, was not a species that used the word "please" often, was the single largest thing she had said. He came 2 steps closer. He went down on one knee beside her. He held the lamp up off her face so the glare would not bother her. He said, through the suit speaker, "My name is Sam Holloway." He said, "I have a salvage hauler at the auxiliary lock and a window of about 18 hours before the Pa-Yin patrols rotate back." He said, "I am a working man." He said, "I do not want trouble with the Tar-Nethi." She looked at him for a long, quiet beat. The coal-smudged blue eyes did not waver. She said, soft and clear, "Then do not start any." He said, "I came here for slip-drive coils." She said, "I know. I watched you for 2 days. I wanted to be sure." He said, "Sure of what?" She said, "That you were not Pine, that you were not Yannick, that you were a working man." She said, "I have been watching salvagers come through this field for a week and a half." She said, "You are the first one who did not radio for a recovery bonus." She said, "The recovery bonus is for finding bodies." He said, I am not in the body business. She said no. I observed. He thought about it for a count of 4. He thought about the 18 hours. He thought about the patrols. He thought about the fact that the woman in front of him was a Tarnethi warden of the 3rd rank, which meant she had killed people for a living, professionally, for a decade. He thought about the small, folded photograph of his brother Caleb on the inside of his suit collar. He thought about the way Caleb's eyes had looked the day he shipped out for Severin 4. He thought, very simply, that he had not pulled his brother out of any wreck, and he was not going to leave a dying woman in this one. He said, "Can you walk?" She said no. He said, "Can you stand?" She said briefly. He said, "Then we will work with that." He pulled the second filter mask from the thigh pouch of his suit. He fitted it gently over her face. He pulled the small emergency rebreather pack from the small of his back and clipped it to her belt. He said, "I am going to lift you." She said, "You should not." He said, "I know." He lifted her. She weighed less than the netted slip drive coils outside on the hull. He carried her in the careful upright way you carry a body with a fragment through it, with one arm under her shoulder and one supporting the small of her back where the fragment was not, his suit's mag boots clamping the deck at half power so he would not jolt her with a stride. He spoke to her the whole way, low and steady, the same voice he used to talk himself through dangerous EVA work alone, and she answered in short, economical fragments when she had the breath. She told him her name in the second corridor, Veska. She told him her rank in the 3rd, Warden of the 3rd, formerly of the Vakar Sail Regiment, formerly meaning 2 months ago, currently meaning fugitive. She told him the regiment in the 4th, a high command unit out of the Tarnethi capital fleet that had been seconded to a joint Yannick operation in the Rim. She told him, in fragments across the long walk to the auxiliary lock, that the joint operation had ordered a civilian burn strike on a Yannick-affiliated colony of Krell refugees on the planet Halen 9. And her direct commanding officer had ordered her unit to execute the strike, and she had refused. She had killed her commanding officer with the same curved knife now at her hip. She had broken ranks. She had been hunted by her own forces as a deserter and a traitor for 2 months. She had been cornered at the Dry Hesht convoy fight, had crawled aboard the escort frigate during the boarding chaos, had hidden in the cargo deck while the convoy died around her, and had been waiting in this corner since, conscious for the last 6 days, expecting to die. She told him this in fragments. She did not editorialize. She told him as if she were filing a report. The Calder was a small 40-meter salvage hauler, painted the dull rust orange of a working ship that had not been repainted since her second registration, with the Brenardi Salvage Guild insignia faded along her port flank. He brought Veska through the auxiliary lock and into the Calder's main corridor. He sealed the lock behind them. He brought her into the narrow compartment off the cargo bay that he used as a washroom and laid her gently on the steel bench seat that doubled as a triage table when he needed it to. He sealed the washroom door. He pulled his helmet off. He pulled the second filter mask off her face. He had to work fast. He cut her armor open along the side of the wound with his salvage shears, careful around the fragment. He did not pull the fragment. He had been a salvager long enough to know that you did not pull the fragment in a small ship without proper transfusion equipment, because the fragment was the only thing keeping the artery closed. He cleaned the wound around the fragment as best he could with the contents of his medkit, which contained a Brenari spec emergency clotting foam and a Voth spec antiseptic, and a single ampule of universal painkiller he had never expected to need on his own ship. He used all 3. He packed the wound with fresh wadding. He covered her with a thermal blanket because her skin was very cold and getting colder. He sealed the door and went forward to the cockpit. He fired the Calder's engines without filing a departure plan. The Calder lifted out of the salvage field along her tow cable axis, dragging the netted cargo of slip-drive coils and the Brenari nav rotor behind her like a small tail of stolen weather. He punched into slip space at an angle the manual did not particularly recommend. He set a course for a System 3 jumps out where he had a small contact, a Brenari shipfitter named Joash, who could be trusted to remove a fragment from a person without asking the Tar-Nethi Warfleet for clearance. He let the autopilot take the long, quiet stretches. He went back to the washroom. He sat on the deck beside the bench. He watched her chest rise and fall. He watched it slow, then steady, then slow again, then steady again, in the long, careful rhythm of a person who was not yet dying, but who was not yet not dying either. He sat there for nearly 6 hours. He did not, in those 6 hours, allow himself to think about why he was sitting there. He had not, until that day, sat in his own washroom watching anyone breathe since he was 16 years old and watching his older sister Min recover from a workplace accident on the Breza 3 mining colony. And he had not let himself remember Min's face that long, that close in 22 years. He let himself remember it now. The Calder hummed through slip transit. Veska of the Tar-Nethi Wardens did not stop breathing. Joash on the Brenari shipfitter station above Dre's reach took the fragment out of her side at the 17th hour of the journey. Joash was a long-armed Brenari with 8 knuckled fingers per hand and a private surgical bay above his hangar that he had built himself after he had retired from the Brenari Medical Corps and decided he wanted to do quieter work. Joash did not ask Sam Holloway who the patient was. Joash had read the species marker on the ident strip Sam handed him at the airlock and had inclined his eye stalks the careful Brenari 1/4 millimeter that meant, "I know what you are bringing me, and I'm not going to ask any further questions." Joash pulled the fragment under sedation. He cleaned the wound. He repaired the nicked artery. He grafted Brenari spec replacement tissue over the gap. He gave Veska a unit of universal compatible plasma and a course of Tar-Nethi-friendly antibiotics he had pulled from his retirement supply. He charged Sam Holloway 8,000 salt credits for the procedure, plus another 2,000 for the discreet recovery of his retirement supply. And Sam paid all of it without arguing. The 8,000 was almost the entire profit of his salvage run. He paid it and tipped Joash an extra 500 and asked Joash, on the way out, whether anyone had been asking around the rim about a Tar-Nethi warden of the 3rd rank. Joash made a small clicking sound. Joash said, "The Tar-Nethi Warfleet has a price on her head." Joash said, "The price is high." Joash said, "I would not, if I were you, dock at any Payan compact port in the next 6 standard months." Sam Holloway thanked him and left. She came out of sedation 11 hours later in the auxiliary bunk of the Calder, in a clean sleep tunic of soft, Brenari gray wool that Joash had thrown in with the procedure as a parting gift. The wound was bandaged. The fragment, washed clean, was sitting in a small, clear specimen jar Sam had clipped to the bulkhead near the bunk because he had thought she might want it. She did. She looked at the jar in the dim light of the cabin. She looked at him in the second chair beside the bunk. She lifted her chin in the small, precise motion of a Tar-Nethi, acknowledging a debt. She said, in a voice that was steadier than it had been on the wreck, "I owe you a life." He shook his head. He said, "You owe me a Brenari surgical bill, which I have paid. And you can call it square once you can walk again." She said, "No." She said, I am not from a culture that calls a life square against a Brenari surgical bill. He said, I know. I was being polite. The kohl was gone from her eyes now, washed off by the surgical prep, and her pupils were the clean, clear steel blue of a hard frost morning. She watched him for a long beat. She said, Where are we? He said, in slip transit on a slow arc out toward a Brenari sanctuary world called Meridor. He said, I know a couple working a refuge there who can hide you for the time it takes to figure out next steps. He said, after Meridor, I will need to disappear for a while. She said, I am sorry. He said, do not be. He said I needed to disappear for a while anyway. She told him, in the small, careful pieces that came out across the next 3 jumps, the architecture of her life. She had been born on the Tarnethi capital world of Tarnek into a low-house military family that had kept the same regiment seat for 9 generations. She had trained at the War Academy from the age of 11. She had served in 2 Rim conflicts before the joint Yannick operation. She had risen to warden of the 3rd rank at 31, which was unusually fast for a low-house officer. She told him, when he asked carefully, that she was 42 years old, which surprised him because she did not look it, and which she explained by saying that Tarnethi aged slowly until they did not. She told him about the civilian burn strike order on Halen 9 and the 417 Krell refugees the order had been intended to kill. And she told him, very flatly, the names of the 4 members of her unit who had carried out the order anyway. She told him, also flatly, that her commanding officer had drawn his coil pistol on her when she had refused, and that she had killed him with the curved knife now in the bulkhead clip beside her bunk. She told him she had spent the next 2 months running through the Rim systems, trying to reach a Krell refugee enclave on Cold Arrow that she had heard might shelter her, and had been intercepted near the Dry Hesht convoy by a Tarnethi pursuit detachment. She had crawled into the escort frigate as a last resort. She had not expected to live. She had certainly not expected a salvager. She asked him, on the 3rd night of the journey, why he had not called her people. He thought about it for a long minute before he answered. He told her, in fewer words than he had ever told anyone, about Caleb, his younger brother. Caleb had been 22 years old when he had shipped out for the Severin IV reclamation conflict. Caleb had been a quiet kid, slow to speak, the kind of kid whose teachers had always told their mother that he was bright but introverted. Caleb had enlisted because the family had needed the bonus pay after Sam's first salvage operation had failed and left him in debt. Caleb had been deployed for 14 months. Caleb had not come home. The official letter from the War Office had said he had died honorably in action against a Yannick militia. The official letter had also said his remains had not been recovered. Sam had been working salvage on Rim battlefields for 8 years since. He had not, in those 8 years, found his brother's remains. He told her also the smaller thing he had not, in 8 years, told anyone. He told her that Caleb had written him a single letter in the last week of his deployment, a letter that had reached Sam 2 days after the War Office letter had. And the letter had said, in Caleb's careful, slow handwriting, that the unit had been ordered to do a thing that Caleb did not believe was right, and that Caleb did not know what he was going to do about it. Sam had carried the letter with him on every salvage run since. He had carried it also inside the small folded photograph on the inside of his suit collar. He had not, in 8 years, allowed himself to know what he had begun to suspect about how Caleb had died. Veska of the Tarnethi Wardens listened to all of this in the calm, full attention of a person who had been the kind of officer who actually listened to her own people when they spoke. She did not interrupt. When he was done, she said very quietly, the storm gray of her skin shifting slightly under the cabin lights, with a faint internal flicker that he understood after a moment was the Tarnethi equivalent of a person clearing their throat to speak honestly. Your brother was killed by his own side. He looked at her. She said more carefully, I cannot prove that. But I can tell you that the joint operation has run civilian burn orders on rim conflicts for the last 15 years. And I can tell you that the official letters always say honorable action against the enemy. And I can tell you that the troops who refuse to carry out the burns are not always recovered as remains. She said, in the same low, careful voice, Your brother sounds like a person who would have refused. He said, in a voice that had to come up through a long, quiet place, I have thought so. I have not, in 8 years, let myself think so. She said, I am sorry, Sam Holloway. He said, I am sorry too. About yours? They sat for a long stretch of slip transit in the small, warm dim of the auxiliary cabin. Outside the porthole, the long quiet of jump space went on the way it always did. After a while, she said, soft, Will you do something for me, Sam Holloway? He said, Name it. She said, When I am better, when I am somewhere safe, do not stop being the kind of working man who sits on a cargo deck for 2 days, watching whether a salvager is the kind he can trust. He said, I will not. She said, Good. She said, The rim needs more of those. He set her down on Marador's sanctuary world at the long gray hour before dawn, at the discreet refuge of a Solari healer's order Joash had given him directions to. The Solari took her in without asking questions. He stood at the threshold a moment after they had taken her past the inner door. The eldest healer turned at the threshold, looked at him with the steady, patient violet eyes of a Solari who had lived through her own war, and inclined her head a small fraction. She said, in careful common galactic, The Tarnethi warden will live. She said, You have done what was required. She said, Go quietly, salvager. He went quietly. He came back to the Calder. He sat in the cockpit for a long time before he set a course. Veska had asked him, before they had landed, not to call her people. He understood, sitting there in the warm dim of the cabin, that she had not, in 8 years, been asking what he thought she had been asking. She had not been asking him to keep her hidden because she was afraid. She had been asking him to keep her hidden because she was building. He set a course for a small frontier station, 3 jumps out where he had a contact who could change his transponder. He left Marador behind. He went to ground. The Tarnethi war frigate came for him at the end of his 2nd week on a small frontier station called Outer Cinder 3. He had been there working a quiet contract, helping a Brenari shipfitter strip a derelict hauler in dock for parts. He had been paid in scrip and silence. He had not advertised his transponder. He had not told anyone he was on Outer Cinder 3. The Tarnethi war frigate came in anyway, at the 3rd hour past dawn, and set down hard in the docking apron, with the long, thin shadow of a vessel that had not asked permission to be there. Sam Holloway was sitting in the station's small cantina at the end of his shift. He saw the shadow of the war frigate cross the cantina window. He set his coffee cup down. He understood in the small, flat way a working man understands a thing what was happening. He stood up. He paid his tab. He walked out through the loading corridor toward the docking apron with both hands visible at his sides. The Tarnethi boarding party met him at the inner airlock. They were 6. They were in dark matte leathers with the same braided spear sigil Veska had worn, though theirs were marked at the 3rd rank in the small private way. Tarnethi rank marks were always marked. The captain of the boarding party was a tall, storm-gray-skinned man with the long campaign coals smudged around his eyes and a curved knife identical to Vesca's at his hip. He spoke very precise, common galactic. He said, "Salvager Holloway." Sam said, "That is me." The captain said, "You are a person of interest in an active Tarnethi Warfleet inquiry." Sam said, "I do not doubt it." The captain said, "You will accompany us aboard our ship for questioning." Sam said, "I would prefer not to." The captain said, "Your preference is not relevant." Sam said, "I understand." He went with them. The interrogation took 11 hours. He sat in a small, bare interview room aboard the Tarnethi war frigate with his hands cuffed in front of him, and a long-scarred Tarnethi Inquisitor across the table from him in the same dark matte leathers. The Inquisitor asked calmly where Vesca of the Vakar Sail Regiment currently was. Sam said, "I do not know." The Inquisitor asked when he had last seen her. Sam said, 15 days ago. The Inquisitor asked whether he could be more specific. Sam was. The Inquisitor asked at what location he had last seen her. Sam said, "On the surface of a planet I am not going to name." The Inquisitor was patient. The Inquisitor was, in fact, very patient. The Inquisitor was the kind of patient that meant a person could be in a small room with him for a very long time. Sam Holloway had been in small rooms with patient men before. He had been in a salvage hauler depressurization for 9 hours alone with a broken airline at the age of 19. He had been in a Payan customs office holding cell for 3 days at the age of 26. He understood what a small room with a patient man was. He answered every question with care. He answered the questions about location truthfully, without naming the location. He answered the questions about the route truthfully, without naming the route. He answered the questions about Vesca's condition truthfully, alive, with surgical care, in a place where he believed she would survive. He did not, in 11 hours, tell the Inquisitor where she was. At the end of the 11th hour, the Inquisitor sat back in his chair and watched Sam Holloway for a long, quiet stretch. He said eventually, "You are not a Tarnethi citizen." Sam said, "I am not." The Inquisitor said, "The woman you are protecting is a Tarnethi war criminal under our law." Sam said, "The woman I am protecting refused a civilian burn strike on 417 Krell refugees on Holland 9. The Inquisitor said, "That is the inside view." Sam said, "That is the only view that matters to me." The Inquisitor said, "You will not, in this interview, tell me where she is." Sam said, "No." The Inquisitor said, "Our protocol is to detain non-citizens who do not cooperate for an indefinite term in a Tarnethi facility, until cooperation is secured." Sam said, "I imagined so." The Inquisitor said, "You understand what you are choosing." Sam said, "I do." The Inquisitor said, "Very well." The Inquisitor stood. He did not, however, summon the guards. He stood at the table and looked at Sam Holloway for a long beat. He said, in a voice softer than the formal cadence he had been using, "You are an unusual non-citizen, Salvager Holloway." Sam said, "I have been told." The Inquisitor said, "I will note for the record that you cooperated to the limit of your moral capacity." Sam said, "That is generous." The Inquisitor said, "It is also accurate." The Inquisitor pressed a small command on the interview room console. The cuffs released. He said, "I am not going to detain you." Sam looked at him. The Inquisitor said, "The inquiry has changed in the last hour while you and I were speaking." The Inquisitor said, "The High Command has just authorized a quiet review of the civilian burn order on Holland 9. The Inquisitor said, "This does not mean you should travel through Tarnethi-controlled space for the next year. But it does mean we are not going to detain a non-citizen salvager who answered our questions truthfully." The Inquisitor escorted him personally to the airlock. Sam walked back across the docking apron to the cantina with his hands free and his transponder still mostly his own. He sat back down at the same table. His coffee was cold. He drank it anyway. He left Outer Cinder 3 the same shift the Inquisitor walked him back to the airlock. He did not pack carefully. He filed a deliberate decoy departure plan with the dock master, and then took off 40 minutes early on a different vector. He punched into slip space twice in the first hour, scrubbed his transponder once, and drifted on cold engine power for an additional 8 hours through the long quiet of an empty asteroid corridor, before he engaged a clean second rotor ident and angled for a system in the rim he had not worked in 7 years. He did this the way a salvager does a thing he has practiced in his head for half his career and never expected to actually need. He did this the way a man does a thing, because his brother had once written him a letter from the lip of a wrong order and not lived long enough to send a follow-up. The system he angled for was Maridor's Far Moon, a small Brennari-administered dark side settlement called Shoal 12, where the salvage cooperative had a quiet annex. He set down at Shoal 12 in the long gray hour before the moon's planetary night cycle. He paid the docking fee in scrip. He registered under the second rotor ident as Sam Cade, a name he had used twice before in his career and which still cleared the Brennari-administered customs database without comment. He took a small bunk in the cooperative's communal residence. He worked Shoal 12 for 8 months on shorthand contracts, pulling salvage from a Drekai Hesht skirmish field that the Brennari cooperative had been quietly trying to clear. He met a quiet Sodash named Wren on his second contract there. A slim, careful pilot with a Brennari mechanical aptitude and a history of her own she did not unpack to anyone. They worked 4 contracts together in the next 9 months. They became, in the small, careful way working people become things in a small settlement, partners. She flew the Calder's second seat. He took the cockpit. They got along the way 2 people get along when neither of them needs anything explained twice. Wren stayed 2 years. She left in the 3rd spring to start her own salvage cooperative on Cold Arrow, with a small partnership offer that Sam declined gently because he had begun to feel, by then, that the work he was doing was not exactly work that had partners in it. She left him 3 things at the parting: a small Sodash carved bone amulet for the Calder's cockpit dash, a sealed envelope of fresh transponder authorization codes that the Cold Arrow Salvage Cooperative had quietly granted him, and a single sentence, spoken at the airlock with her steady, soft Sodash voice, that he carried with him for the rest of his career. She said, "Sam, when you find what you are looking for, do not stop looking." He had not understood it that day. He understood it later. Wren turned out to be an exceptional reader of working men. He worked the rim alone after Wren. He took on a small, careful list of contracts that the Brennari Salvage Cooperative began routing to him without ever putting the routing in writing. He pulled remains when he was asked. He pulled parts when he was paid. He kept careful records. He filed his manifests. He met, in the 2nd year, a Solari healer at a Maridor refugee dock, who quietly told him that a Tar-Nethi warden of the 3rd rank had survived a long abdominal fragment surgery the year before, was rehabilitating well at an undisclosed sanctuary, and had begun, in the small, careful way certain Tar-Nethi reformers had begun, to work on what they were calling the new code. The Solari healer did not say more than that. Sam did not ask more. He carried the small piece of news inside him through the rest of the 2nd year, like a stone he had picked up on a beach he could not return to. He read every Cantina newsfeed that mentioned the Tar-Nethi war fleet. He noticed, in the 3rd year, the small, careful articles that began to appear about a Tarnethi reform movement, conducted from inside the war fleet, that had begun to challenge certain protocols on rim civilian engagements. He did not let himself think too closely about who was driving the reform. He kept salvaging. He paid his fees. He fixed his recycler. He shimmed his port stabilizer. He kept the small, folded photograph of his brother Caleb on the inside of his suit collar. He turned 40 in the 4th winter. He did not particularly mark the day. He had a contract to finish, a Ionic belt skirmish field on the cold side of Severin 4 that he had been trying to angle into for 6 months under his 2nd rotor ident, because the field was suspected to contain wreckage from the dry-class transport that had carried Caleb's unit 8 years before. The contract authorization came through on the 2nd day of his 40th year, signed off by an unfamiliar registration office that called itself only the Tarnethi Reformation Logistics Group. He did not know what the Reformation Logistics Group was. He filed the contract. He took the work. He spent 10 weeks pulling slow, careful parts and remains out of the Severin 4 skirmish field. He found, on the 72nd day of the contract, a dry-class transport hull fragment with the small unit marking of his brother's regiment etched into the inner bulkhead. The hull fragment had already been catalogued and the remains already pulled by an earlier salvage team operating under the same Reformation Logistics Group authorization. Sam Holloway sat in the cockpit of the Calder and Slip Transit out of the Severin 4 system the next morning. And he understood, in the small, flat way a working man understands a thing, that someone had gotten there before him on purpose, and that the someone had been waiting for him to find the cleared site so he would know. He did not chase the trail. He had learned in 4 years that chasing a Tarnethi-administered trail was a way of getting somebody else into trouble. He kept salvaging. He worked 3 more contracts that winter, pulled a Drekai family's remains out of a small pine skirmish field on Cold Arrow, took the family's quiet thanks in the form of a small bottle of Drekai winter spirits he never opened. He logged everything in his small black logbook. He wrote down every name. He cycled his transponder 1 more time into a 3rd rotor ident under the Bernari Salvage Guild registry. He waited. He understood, by the end of the 4th winter, that he was waiting for something. He did not know what. He did not need to know. He had learned also in those 4 years that some things came when they came, and a working man's job in the meantime was to keep working and to keep his logbook clean and to keep the lantern in the cabin lit on the long, quiet nights when nobody was coming up the dock. He spent the next 4 years quietly working salvage along the rim. He cycled through 3 transponder ident rotors. He took on a partnership with a quiet Sodash named Wren, who flew the Calder's 2nd seat for 2 of the 4 years and then left to start her own salvage cooperative on Cold Arrow. He did not, in those 4 years, contact Vesca. He understood, the same way a salvager understands a slow leak, that the safest thing he could do for her was to be exactly the kind of working man Joash had paid him 8,000 salt credits to be. He did salvage. He paid his fees. He filed his manifests. He took on, without ever writing it down, a small, careful list of refugee runs from rim battlefields that the Tarnethi Warfleet Inquiry had quietly authorized salvagers like him to make under a new protocol he was not officially aware of. He pulled remains for Brennery families when families asked. He pulled remains for Solari families and Drekai families and Parin families. He kept careful records in a logbook that he showed to nobody. He did not, in 4 years, find his brother's remains. He kept looking. He turned 42 in the 4th spring. He had been on a long, careful pull through a Severin 4 battlefield site, looking for the wreck of the dry-class transport that had carried Caleb's unit 8 years ago, when the Tarnethi cruiser arrived in the system. He saw it on his long-range scope before he saw the ship. He saw the ship before he saw the markings. The markings were the braided spear's sigil he had once seen on a dying officer's chest plate. But the sigil had been altered. Beneath the spear had been added a single horizontal bar in soft, pale gray, the formal mark of the Tarnethi Reformation Council, a body that had not existed 8 years ago and existed now by the slow, patient work of 2 years of Tarnethi Warfleet reform that Sam Holloway had read about in the Cantina news feeds without quite letting himself follow what was driving it. The cruiser keyed his comm to the universal hailing channel and said, "Salvager Holloway, the Speaker of the Reformation Council, requests your presence." He sat in his pilot chair. He felt the 4 years rearrange themselves in his chest. He said on the comm, "I will be along." He flew the Calder the 8 kilometers across to the Tarnethi cruiser. The cruiser opened her forward hangar to him, and he sat down on her deck. Veska of the Tarnethi Wardens met him at the bottom of the Calder's ramp. She was 46 years old by then, by the slow Tarnethi count. She was no longer thin. She was no longer wounded. She wore the soft, pale gray diplomatic robes of a Speaker of the Reformation Council, with a small braided spear and bars sigil pinned at her throat in burnished bronze. The campaign coal was gone from her eyes. The half-shaved warrior crop had grown out into a long, even, bone-meal white braid down her back. The curved knife was not at her hip. She held herself like a person who had figured out, in 4 patient years, how to lay down the things she did not need to carry anymore. She bowed her head a small fraction when he came down the ramp. He bowed his back. She said, in the same precise common galactic, "Salvager Holloway." He said, "Speaker." She said, "Walk with me." They walked the long, polished hangar corridor of the Tarnethi Reformation cruiser side by side. She told him, in pieces along the walk, what had happened. The civilian burn protocols had been criminalized 2 years ago by a vote of the new Tarnethi Council she had helped build out of the Warfleet reform fragment. The 4 members of her old unit who had carried out the strike on Halen 9 had been tried and convicted under the new code. The high command officers who had issued the original order had resigned or been removed. The Reformation Council was a small, careful body, half military, half civilian, working the slow work of changing the Tarnethi Warfleet from the inside. She had not, in 4 years, sent him a message. She said, "I knew, when I asked you on the Calder, that the safest gift I could give you was 4 years of silence." He said, "I figured." She said, "I am sorry for the silence." He said, "Do not be." He said, "I have not been quiet for nothing." She brought him into a small private office at the end of the corridor. The walls were lined with bookshelves of hard-copy Tarnethi battle records that the Reformation Council had been working through, case by case. On the small, carved wooden desk in the center of the room sat a slim gray ident card holder. She gestured for him to sit. He sat. She did not sit. She picked up the ident card holder. She set it down on the desk in front of him. She said, 8 months ago, we recovered the wreck of the dry-class transport you have been looking for in a ionic debris field in the Severin 4 system. She said, the Reformation Council has been doing slow, careful work, pulling remains from old joint operation battlefields and matching them to family registries. She said, your brother was in that wreck. She said his remains were intact. She said his unit's records survived. She said the records confirm, in the unit commander's own log, that your brother and 3 others refused a civilian burn order on the 2nd day of the conflict. and were executed by their own ranking officer for the refusal. She said, "The records confirm also that the 4 were officially listed as honorable casualties to the enemy because the alternative would have implicated the entire chain of command." She said, "Your brother's remains are in a sealed Tarnethi-flagged transport on its way to your home colony of Breza 3 at this moment." She said, "The transport will arrive in 6 standard days." She said, "His commanding officer has been arrested." She said, "The trial is in session." He sat very still in the chair across from her for a long stretch. He picked up the ident card holder. He opened it. Inside were his brother's 2 service ident tags, recovered, cleaned, and placed against a simple dark gray backing. The tags were dented, scarred, weathered by 8 years in a ionic debris field, but the lettering was still legible. He read his brother's name. He read the unit number. He read the service date. He closed the holder. He closed his eyes for a long count. He opened them. He looked across the desk at Veska of the Tarnethi Wardens, formerly warden of the 3rd rank, now Speaker of the Reformation Council, the woman he had carried out of the cargo deck of a dead frigate 4 years ago because she had asked him not to call her people. He said, in a voice that had to come up through 22 years of held quiet, "Thank you." She said very softly, "You have been thinking the wrong direction for 8 years. Salvager Holloway." He said, "I know." She said, "I will not be returning your kindness." She said, "I will be paying a debt the Tarnethi war fleet owes you and your brother and 417 Krell refugees and a great many other people. And the debt is not in any ledger I can fully reconcile." She said, "The small piece of it I am giving you today is a piece I owe you personally." He nodded. He could not speak for a moment. She let him. The small Tarnethi-flagged transport carrying Caleb's remains arrived at Breza 3 on the 6th standard day. Sam Holloway was on the dock to receive it, with his older sister Min, who had flown in from her settlement on the inner moon, and with the small folded photograph from the inside of his suit collar held in his palm. They buried Caleb in the family plot on the upper terrace of the colony cemetery, where their mother and father had been buried 26 years before. The Tarnethi Reformation Council sent a single small carved bronze marker for the headstone, a thin horizontal bar that meant, in the new Tarnethi Reformation iconography, a soldier who had refused a wrong order. Min set the marker into the headstone with her own hands. The colony chaplain spoke a short, careful service. Sam did not say anything aloud. He stood at the foot of the grave and read his brother's letter for the last time. The careful, slow handwriting of a 22-year-old Caleb Holloway, who had not known what he was going to do about a thing he did not believe was right. And Sam folded the letter once and placed it gently against the bronze marker and weighted it with a small gray stone he had carried in his pocket for 8 years. He stood there until the wind off the inner moon picked up enough to lift the letter free, and the letter went. He did not, in that moment, cry. He had cried enough about Caleb in 8 years of salvage work alone to last a lifetime. He stood at the grave with his sister beside him and watched the stars come up over the upper terrace of the cemetery. He went back to salvage. He went back to it differently. He took only Tarnethi-flagged contracts after that, the kind the Reformation Council quietly authorized for working salvagers like him under the new protocols. And he made a slow, careful living pulling remains and recovering parts and writing down, in a small black logbook he kept in the cabin drawer of the Calder beside the ident card holder, the names of every soldier whose remains he found. He found, over the next 9 years, the remains of 143 soldiers. Some of them were Tarnethi, some of them were not. He logged them all. He sent the names to the Reformation Council. He matched, in his own quiet way, what the council was doing with what he was doing. He did not become famous. He did not write to Vesca. He understood, by the 8th year of the protocol, that the small, careful work of pulling a body out of a battlefield and writing the name down in a logbook was the work he had been put on the rim to do, and the work he was going to keep doing, and the work that was going to outlast him. He did not, in those 9 years, stop missing his brother. He did not, in those 9 years, stop being grateful that he had stopped on the cargo deck of a dead frigate when a dying woman had asked him not to call her people. When he was very old, he sat on the porch of a small house he had bought on Bredza 3, on the upper terrace not far from the family plot, and he watched the stars come up over the inner moon. The Calder was parked at the edge of the field below the house. Her Brennari salvage guild patch faded soft now after 30 more years of work. The small black logbook sat on a shelf above the kitchen door. The ident card holder sat beside it. The folded photograph of Caleb was on the bedside table, where Sam had grown into a man who could look at it without flinching. He thought sometimes, on those long porch evenings, about the cargo deck of the dry-heshed escort frigate, and the storm-gray woman folded into the corner behind the racking and the steel-blue eyes that had asked him for the one specific small thing. He had given her that thing. She had given him in return his brother's name back. He had not been a hero. He had only stopped on a cargo deck because a working man stops when a working man can stop. The galaxy had remembered him longer than he had remembered himself. Some kindnesses, he had learned, came back as the truth a man had been afraid to ask for. Sometimes a soldier in a corner was a question disguised as a request, and the answer to the question turned out to be a brother's name carved into a bronze marker on a hillside on the upper terrace of a colony cemetery, and the chain of small refusals that had to happen before that name could be carved was a chain. A salvager could begin to feel honored to be one link in. The fragment was gone. The wound was closed. The cargo deck was at the bottom of a ionic debris field that the Reformation Council had finally cleaned. The logbook was full. He had been enough. That had been enough. That had, in the end, been everything.